Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Pain is an inescapable part of existence. It weaves itself into the fabric of our lives, shaping who we are and how we perceive the world. And in those darkest moments when suffering becomes unbearable, when the weight of sorrow presses down so heavily that it seems impossible to move, there is an instinctive cry, a plea for something beyond ourselves. That is not an illusion. That is not mere desperation. That is the deep-rooted knowledge that something hears, something knows, something cares. To think that pain is meaningless, that it exists in isolation, is to misunderstand its nature. Pain is a signal, a message that something is wrong, something that must be confronted, understood, integrated. It does not go unnoticed. When you suffer, when you fall to your knees in despair, that suffering is not in vain. There is an intelligence beyond comprehension that sees, that listens, that understands, and it is not indifferent. Consider what it means to cry out in agony. That cry is an admission not of weakness but of need. It is an act of faith, whether conscious or unconscious. It is the assertion that there is something in the universe that can respond, that there is a purpose to the suffering, that even in the bleakest moments there is the possibility of redemption. This is something deeply embedded in our religious and philosophical traditions. The idea that suffering is seen, that justice exists beyond what is immediately apparent, that even in isolation, one is not truly alone. If you believe that your pain is invisible, that no one hears your cries, you are led into despair. You become untethered, disconnected from the fundamental structure of reality. But that is a lie. The mere fact that you are aware of your suffering, that you feel its weight, that you long for relief, this is proof that you are part of something greater. You wouldn't cry out if there was no ear to hear, no mind to understand, no force to acknowledge the burden. The structure of existence is such that pain has meaning, and meaning presupposes a listener. Your suffering matters. It is not arbitrary, it is not ignored, and it is not eternal. The world has been shaped by those who carried their burdens forward, who transformed their pain into wisdom, who refused to succumb to the notion that suffering was futile. And what carried them through? The knowledge, the certainty that their cries were heard, that their pain was known, that they were not abandoned. There is a reason that the most profound figures in human history, figures of strength, resilience, and wisdom, spoke not of an indifferent universe, but of a force that sees and understands. The depth of human suffering has been acknowledged across cultures, across time, across the greatest narratives ever told. And they all echo the same truth. Pain is not unnoticed. Your suffering is not forgotten. And even in your loneliest moments, you are never truly alone. Pain is not random. It is not some meaningless burden imposed upon you by a cold and indifferent universe. If that were true, if suffering had no purpose, then despair would be the only rational response. But that is not the case. The structure of reality itself suggests otherwise. Pain is deeply embedded in the very fabric of existence, and it serves a function, one that is both necessary and transformative. Consider what pain does. It is a signal, first and foremost. When you touch something hot, you pull your hand away. When you lose someone you love, you feel the immense weight of grief. In both cases, pain forces an acknowledgement of reality. It compels action, adaptation, and growth. If you ignored pain, if it meant nothing, you would walk blindly into destruction. Pain forces you to stop, to assess, to understand. It shapes your perception of the world and demands that you improve. Now think about this on a deeper level. If pain were merely an arbitrary phenomenon, if it were nothing more than an unfortunate side effect of existence, why would it provoke such an intense psychological and emotional response? Why would it demand meaning? People do not suffer in silence. They cry out, they search for answers, they look for explanations. That in itself is evidence that suffering is not empty, it drives us towards something. What is that something? It is transformation, growth, the development of strength and resilience. Pain, when faced head-on, refines you. It strips away falsehoods, exposes your weaknesses, and forces you to either crumble or rise. And here's the truth. Those who endure, those who carry their suffering with dignity and purpose, become formidable. They become wise. They become the people others turn to in times of crisis. Look at history. Every great figure, every philosopher, every leader, every person who left a mark on the world suffered. And yet, rather than being crushed by it, they integrated their suffering into their being. They found meaning in it. They allowed it to shape them into something more than they were before. That's not an accident. It's a fundamental pattern. Religious traditions have recognized this for thousands of years. The idea of suffering as a refining fire is deeply embedded in the great narratives of human civilization. Christ endured suffering not because it was meaningless, but because it was the necessary path toward redemption. Buddha sought to understand suffering because doing so was the key to transcendence. These aren't just old stories, they are reflections of something real, something universal. So, the question is not whether pain is meaningful. The question is whether you are willing to accept that meaning, to engage with it, to allow it to mold you into something greater. Because pain will come whether you want it to or not. And when it does, you have a choice. You can see it as a cruel accident, or you can see it as the catalyst for growth, wisdom, and the emergence of a stronger, more resilient version of yourself. Pain isolates. It pulls you into yourself, convincing you that no one sees, no one hears, no one understands. And that is one of the most dangerous beliefs a person can have. Because if your suffering is invisible, if it doesn't matter, then what justification is there for enduring it? If no one hears your cries, if your agony goes unnoticed, then despair becomes the logical conclusion. But that isn't true, and it has never been true. The very structure of human existence suggests otherwise. First, consider the sheer fact that you can suffer. That suffering has weight, has depth, has consequence. It would not feel so unbearable if it were meaningless. Your pain is real because it is significant. And significance presupposes attention something sees, something knows. If suffering were truly unseen, you wouldn't even feel the need to express it. But you do. You cry out, whether in words, in actions, in silent moments of despair. You long to be heard. And that longing is not a delusion, it's an indication of something fundamental about existence. You are seen. Your pain matters. And the evidence for this is everywhere. Look at history, look at culture, look at the stories that have shaped civilizations. They are filled with suffering accounts of betrayal, loss, agony, and yet these stories endure because suffering was recognized, recorded, and remembered. Why do we still read Job's cries of anguish? Why do we still contemplate Christ's suffering on the cross? Why do we tell stories of redemption, of struggle, of overcoming unbearable burdens? Because these stories affirm what we know deep down: pain is not ignored. Even if you believe no one around you understands, even if you feel like your suffering is invisible in a human sense, that does not mean it is truly unseen. The idea that God hears, that something beyond the material world acknowledges suffering, is one of the most profound ideas humanity has ever produced. And it's not merely an idea, it's something people experience again and again across cultures, across history. The feeling that in the deepest despair, there is something listening, something watching, something that knows. And even on a purely human level, pain resonates. Have you ever shared your suffering with someone and seen how deeply they relate? How it draws them in, compels them to respond. This is not a coincidence. We are wired to recognize suffering in others because pain is meant to be acknowledged. That's why people cry at funerals, why they grieve for those they have never met, why they are moved by the struggles of others. Pain demands recognition, and it receives it whether from others, from history, or from something beyond what we can see. You are not alone. You never were. Your suffering does not exist in a void. It is seen. It is heard. And that realization is the first step out of the darkness, the first step toward meaning, toward healing, toward the realization that even in your loneliest moments, you were never truly abandoned. To cry out in suffering is to reveal something fundamental about the nature of human existence. It is not merely an instinctive reaction to pain. It is an expression of faith, whether or not you recognize it as such. When you cry out, you are engaging in a deeply embedded human pattern, one that presupposes that your suffering is seen, that your voice matters, that something or someone might hear you. And that is no trivial thing. If the world were truly indifferent, if existence were nothing more than a mechanistic, meaningless process, then why would you cry out at all? Why would pain drive you to seek recognition, to call for help, to express the burden of suffering? That response is not random. It has been shaped by something deep, something ancient, something essential to what it means to be human. To cry out is to assume that someone, somewhere, is listening. Think about a child who falls and scrapes their knee. They don't stop to analyze whether calling for their mother will be effective. They simply cry out. It is automatic. It is built into them. They act on the assumption that there is someone who cares, someone who will respond. And more often than not, they are right. That is an act of faith. It is the belief embedded at the deepest levels of our psychology that pain is not meaningless, that suffering is meant to be witnessed, that help is possible. But what about when there is no immediate answer? What about the moments when you cry out and silence follows? That is when faith is truly tested. That is when the depth of the belief is revealed. Because even in those moments, even when the response is not immediate or obvious, the cry itself is still significant. The mere fact that you reach beyond yourself in suffering means that you believe somewhere deep inside that there is something beyond yourself to reach for. Religious traditions have understood this for thousands of years. In the biblical story of Job, he cries out in despair, not because he doubts God's existence, but because he assumes that God hears. His suffering is unbearable, and he demands an answer. That demand itself is an expression of faith. It suggests that justice exists, that meaning exists, that suffering is not simply arbitrary. And this pattern is repeated across cultures, across time. The act of crying out, of calling to God, to the universe, to something beyond oneself is a fundamental human experience. It is proof that we do not accept suffering as pointless. Even outside of religious context, we see this same structure play out. When people suffer, they do not simply accept it in silence. They write, they speak, they protest, they seek connection. They refuse to believe that pain should go unnoticed. Why? Because deep down they know that it matters, and that is faith in action. To cry out is to rebel against the idea that suffering is meaningless. It is to assert that pain has weight, that it should be acknowledged, that there must be something, whether another person, a moral order, or God himself, that listens. Even when the response is not immediate, the act itself is a declaration. This matters, I matter. And that is faith not in the shallow sense of blind belief, but in the profound sense of trusting that existence itself is structured in a way that suffering is not in vain. So, when you are in pain and you cry out, recognize what you are doing. You are acting in alignment with a pattern as old as humanity itself. You are asserting that your suffering should be recognized. You are believing, even if you don't realize it, that someone hears you. And that belief, that fundamental faith, is what has carried people through their darkest moments, through centuries of suffering and struggle. It is what allows people to endure, to find meaning, and ultimately to overcome. Suffering is not unique to you. It feels that way in the moment when pain strikes, when despair takes hold, when you feel isolated in your struggle. But the truth is, suffering is woven into the very fabric of human existence. It is something that unites us, something we all inevitably face, and something that has shaped individuals, cultures, and civilizations for as long as history has been recorded. One of the great lies people tell themselves in times of suffering is that they are alone, that no one else has felt what they feel, that their pain is somehow isolated from the rest of humanity. That is a dangerous belief because it breeds resentment, hopelessness, and despair. It makes suffering feel unbearable, but suffering becomes survivable when it is shared, when it is understood, when it is placed in the broader context of human existence. Every person you meet has suffered. Every individual carries their own burdens, the weight of loss, the sting of betrayal, the terror of uncertainty, the deep sadness of regret. The fact that suffering is universal does not make it trivial, it makes it meaningful. If everyone suffers, then suffering itself must serve some essential purpose. If pain were meaningless, then why would it be a defining feature of every life ever lived? Religious traditions and philosophical systems across history have recognized this. The Buddha taught that life is suffering not as a statement of despair, but as a recognition of reality. Christianity places suffering at the very center of its narrative, with Christ enduring ultimate agony as a means of redemption. The Stoics advised embracing suffering, understanding it, integrating it into one's character, rather than trying to run from it. These traditions endure because they tell us something true, something we already know deep in our bones. And here's what that means for you. Your suffering is not meaningless. It connects you to the rest of humanity. It is the price of existence, but it is also the source of strength, wisdom, and transformation. The worst thing you can do is isolate yourself in your suffering, to believe that you are alone in it. That is where people break. That is where nihilism takes hold. Instead, look at those who have suffered before you, read their words, listened to their stories, understand that others have walked through the fire and emerged stronger, and then recognize that you too can bear the weight of suffering, that you too can endure. That suffering does not just destroy, it also forges. You are not alone in your pain. You never were. The moment you realize that, the burden becomes lighter. It doesn't disappear, but it becomes something you can carry. And when you carry it well, when you face it with courage, you become someone who can help others bear their suffering too. And there is perhaps no greater calling than that. Despair is not simply the presence of suffering. It is the belief that your suffering does not matter, that no one sees it, no one hears it, no one cares. It is the conviction that your pain is isolated, meaningless, and unrecognized. That belief is what crushes people, not just the suffering itself, because pain, no matter how intense, can be endured if it has meaning. But if you convince yourself that it is invisible, that no one acknowledges it, that it exists in a void, then despair is inevitable. Why does this happen? Because human beings are social creatures. We are wired to be seen, to be heard, to be understood. That is why children cry out when they are hurt. They don't just cry because they are in pain. They cry because they need someone to acknowledge that pain. They need to be reassured that they are not alone in it, and that does not change as we grow older. The worst form of suffering is not physical pain, but the feeling that your suffering is irrelevant, that it does not matter to anyone, that it will go unnoticed and unremembered. This is why isolation is so dangerous. People do not just fall into despair because of suffering, they fall into despair because they suffer alone. It is not the weight of the burden that breaks them, it is the belief that no one will help them carry it. That is why solitary confinement is one of the worst punishments a person can endure. That is why people who feel unheard become resentful, bitter, and hopeless. If no one hears you, if no one sees you, then in a very real sense, it feels like you don't even exist. But that belief is a lie, because suffering is never truly invisible. It may feel that way in the moment. You may believe that no one understands, that no one cares, that your pain has no witness. But that is not reality. People have suffered before you in ways that are unimaginable, and they have documented their pain. They have written about it, spoken about it, turned it into stories, philosophies, and faith. Why? Because they wanted to be heard. And the fact that we still read their words today proves that suffering does not simply vanish, it resonates across time, across generations. You may not be heard in the way you expect or by the people you hope for, but that does not mean your suffering is unnoticed. The world itself acknowledges pain. That is why people weep for strangers, why they are moved by stories of suffering, why they feel compelled to reach out and help others. The recognition of pain is built into the structure of human existence. And if you refuse to believe that, if you allow yourself to sink into the belief that your suffering is unheard, you will be consumed by despair. But if you can hold on to the knowledge that pain is seen, that suffering is recognized, that you are not as alone as you think, then you can endure. And not just endure, but emerge stronger. Because despair is not the result of suffering. It is the result of believing a lie about suffering. And once you reject that lie, once you understand that you are heard, you can begin the process of finding meaning, rebuilding hope, and carrying your burden with purpose. Suffering isolates. It convinces you that no one understands, that no one cares, that you are completely and utterly alone in your struggle. And that belief, the belief in your own isolation, is one of the most destructive forces in human existence. It drives people into despair, into resentment, into nihilism. It makes them bitter, weak, and incapable of carrying the burdens that life inevitably places upon them. But here's the truth. You are not alone. You never were. Every single person you encounter has struggled, is struggling, or will struggle in ways that are both unique to them and universally human. Suffering is a condition of existence. It is embedded into the very structure of reality. And yet, despite how deeply personal your pain feels, it is also shared. This is why stories of suffering resonate across cultures and generations, because they speak to something fundamental about what it means to be human. Consider history. The greatest figures, the ones we admire, the ones whose words and actions shape civilizations, were not free from suffering. In fact, they were often shaped by it. They endured loss, betrayal, hardship, illness, failure, and yet they persisted. And they did not persist alone. They found meaning in their suffering. They connected with others through it. They built communities around shared struggle because they understood something crucial. Suffering can either isolate you or it can unite you. And that choice is yours to make. If you look at the people around you, you will see that they too carry burdens. Some of them wear it openly, while others hide it behind a carefully constructed facade. But it is there always, and when you begin to recognize that truth, the world changes. You start to realize that your pain, while deeply personal, is not unique in the way you thought it was. Others have walked similar paths, others have felt what you feel, others have faced darkness and found a way through. This is why human connection is so vital. It is why stories matter. It is why faith, community, friendship, and love exist, because no one can carry their burden alone for long. The weight of suffering is too great. But when suffering is shared, when it is acknowledged, when it is met with understanding rather than isolation, it becomes bearable. It becomes meaningful. And this is where responsibility comes in. Because if you are not alone in your struggles, that also means others are not alone in theirs. You have the ability, the obligation, even to recognize suffering in others and to help them bear it. This is not just an act of kindness, it is an act of survival. It is what allows individuals to endure, families to remain strong, and societies to function. So when you feel alone in your struggles, remind yourself this is not just your battle. This is the battle of all who live. And because of that, you do not have to carry it alone. You never did. And you never will. So what does all of this mean? It means that your suffering is real, but it is not meaningless. It means that your pain is heard, even when you believe it isn't. It means that despair is the result of believing a lie, that you are alone, that no one sees you, that your struggles are isolated. But you are not alone. You never were. The weight of existence is unbearable if you try to carry it by yourself. That's why we turn to one another. That's why we tell stories of suffering and redemption. That's why we cry out in pain, because at some deep, fundamental level, we know that someone is listening. Maybe it's the people around you. Maybe it's those who came before you. Maybe it's something beyond human comprehension. But you are heard. And if you are heard, if your suffering matters, then you have a responsibility to bear it, to find meaning in it, and to help others bear theirs. So stand up, face your suffering. Recognize that it binds you to every person who has ever lived. Refuse to be crushed by it. Let it shape you into something stronger, something wiser, something capable of carrying not just your own burden, but the burdens of others. Because that is how you fight despair. That is how you move forward. That is how you turn suffering into something more than pain, into something that has purpose, into something that makes you who you are meant to be.